Even though it has been around for over 100 years, abstract art still both excites and baffles. Artists, critics, and the art-going public argue about its merits. Serious and not-so-serious social commentators both extol its virtues and ridicule its presumptions. In this video, we're going to take a look at one aspect of modern art known as formalism. To understand formalism, we're going to have to take a quick look at some recent history. In the 18th century, there was, among the intelligentsia, an embrace of reason as a tool for knowing the world. This period of European history is known as the Age of Enlightenment. These ideas about reason give rise to revolutionary thinking in politics, science, religion, and economics. Throughout the 19th century, old patterns and traditions began to break down, and new ideas and forms of expression began to take hold. By the end of the 19th century, the Western world was changed. We enter a period known as modernism. In the pre-modern era, economies were based on agriculture. People and countries were ruled by monarchies. The scientific method was used to study the world and gradually replace superstition and myth as a way to explain natural phenomena. Your sense of identity was wrapped up in your ethnic and cultural background. The value of art resided in how well it provided a mirror on the world. In the modern era, due to the Industrial Revolution, the driver of wealth gradually shifts from agriculture to industry. Revolutions in France and America, soon to be followed by ones in China and Russia, usher in democratic and socialist forms of government. The human psyche becomes a subject of scientific study, and the individual becomes more important. Science postulates that the universe doesn't always behave according to observation. Art becomes a vehicle for individual expression, and originality is prized. Artists from all fields wanted to participate in defining and designing this new modern world. Composer Arnold Schoenberg questioned why music was bound by the traditional 8-tone scale and developed an atonal approach to composition. Alfred Jarry, a French writer, expanded the role of narrative in theater by featuring the absurd. His play Au Boudoir, first performed in Paris in 1896, included swearing, shouting, and general nonsensical dialogue never before seen on a European stage.
Bonjour, messieurs, nous vous attendons avec impatience. Asseyez-vous.
Bonjour, madame. Mais où donc est le père Ubu?
Me voilà, sapristi de par ma chandelle verte. Je suis pourtant assez gros.
Bonjour, père Ubu. Asseyez-vous, mes hommes.
In 1913, producer Sergei Diaghilev brought together composer Igor Stravinsky and dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, and they created the ballet Rite of Spring. Performed by the famous Ballet Russe, the audience expected to see a traditional ballet. When confronted with Stravinsky's music and Nijinsky's choreography, there was a near riot in the theater. The revolution in visual art started in France, the center of the art world in the 19th and 20th century. The Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture was the preeminent art school and set the standard for what was acceptable for artists. What were considered proper subjects by the Academy were paintings of rich people, mythical stories, and maybe a landscape or two. But there were some artists who were more interested in the reality they saw around them and began painting that everyday reality. In 1863, one of those artists, Edouard Manet, paints what some art historians consider to be the first modern painting. His large canvas depicts a group of contemporary bohemian types. The unclothed woman stares directly at us. This painting was rejected by the Academy's annual art show. Manet subsequently showed his painting in the Salon des Refusés, set up by the Emperor Napoleon for artists who were rejected by the Salon's jury. With the painterly style, and not being the usual idealized realism, the painting caused an uproar. But this painting was one of the works that stated that artists could be legitimately revolutionary as well. The concurrent development of photography at this time began to release the artist from depicting reality and allowed for more experimentation with pictorial ideas. Another group of French artists began to look at painting from a different visual perspective. They were interested in portraying reality as the eye actually sees it. Color and light were their concerns. Brushstrokes were placed next to each other rather than blended, and the resulting fuzziness of the scene prompted the critic Louis Leroy to satirically call the style Impressionism. As the experimentation in painting continued, artists moved further from depicting reality to expressing their subjective relationship to the world. Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Cézanne became known as the Post-Impressionists. Their work began to explore the pictorial aspect of color and form. The space in a painting began to flatten, and color became more symbolic. While many artists were experimenting with these ideas, two emerged as leaders in this revolution in painting. Henri Matisse began to take bold steps with color and space. He was a member of the group of artists that is called les fauves, the wild beasts, because of their unrestrained use of color. Pablo Picasso, a young Spanish artist working in Paris, experimented with the various Impressionist and Post-Impressionist styles he was seeing there. Then in 1907, Picasso paints this painting. When Matisse saw it, he thought Picasso had lost his mind. Sharing a studio with another artist named Georges Braque, their experiments with form were based on the idea of trying to show something as it was, not as it looked. Their idea was to try and show all aspects of a subject simultaneously, by analyzing the form and breaking it up into its significant parts. This painting, by Braque, was described as cubic oddities by a critic, and the term stuck. Cubism's revolutionary depiction of form would be a major influence in 20th century art. But is there something more to this focus on form? What, if anything, keeps an emphasis on colors and lines and shapes in a painting from simply forming eye candy? Is there something more that these artists were after? Here we see Harmony in Red by Henri Matisse. Think about that title. Is Matisse interested in representing an interior scene? Or is he interested in creating a harmonious and intriguing visual experience? Look at the elements in the painting. I would contend that his theme is not the interior of a house, but the inventive way he has arranged the formal elements. Even though there is recognizable subject matter, with the flattened space, crude drawing, and bold colors, he is moving towards abstraction for sure. In 1890, painter Maurice Denis wrote in his article, Definition of Neo-Traditionalism, that a painting was essentially a flat surface covered in colors arranged in a certain order. Then he argued that the painting or sculpture or drawing itself, not the subject of the artistic work, gave pleasure to the mind. Clive Bell was an art critic and theorist in the early part of the 20th century. He made a distinction between a thing's actual form and its significant form. A simple example might be a pizza. The actual form of the pizza is dough and sauce and cheese, but the significant form is how all those flavors come together to create something delicious. If there is not a balance, unity, variety, and proportion among the ingredients, then the pizza will not taste good. Could it be that a painting, in order for it to become art, needs these principles in the same way the pizza does? Look at Picasso's painting here. Does he get to the significant form of a weeping woman more than the drawing on the left? As artists move more and more towards abstraction, they began to leave reference to any subject matter, like Matisse's interior or Picasso's woman, behind. The subject matter was now the form of the painting itself. The physical object of the painting held all the information that was needed to extract its meaning. The meaning now is not a story, but rather in the actual arrangements of the elements of the painting and the way that created a visual experience for the viewer. If it evoked an emotional response in the viewer, it did so, and this is the tricky part, because the elements of the painting somehow seemed right or correct. How that was defined was sketchy, but that was where the art was. Joseph Albers took this idea to an extreme. Albers was interested in the interaction of color. He wrote a famous book about it. He chose to paint squares because he didn't care about composition or the elements in his painting. By sticking with the same composition, he could concentrate on the interaction of the color. He painted this series of squares for over 20 years. There is no narrative story in these paintings. This way, the viewer would have only various optical responses to the painting. This optical response is where the aesthetic experience took place. Look at Ed Reinhardt's rules for making a painting. He's trying to reduce painting to its most pure state. What's left in a painting if you take out all those things? Reinhardt would say the only thing left is the art. Then why make a painting at all? Without the painting, then there can be no art. What? So there is some theoretical thinking behind what artists are trying to do, even if it's sometimes difficult to discern simply from looking at the paintings. But in the early 20th century, there was another influence on the development of abstraction as well. In 1888, Helen Petrovna Blavatsky published a book titled The Secret Doctrine, which laid out an esoteric and mystical philosophy on spirituality. It was partly comprised of a complex spiritual hierarchy of otherworldly spiritual teachers and how one might perfect themselves. The main idea was that there could be a higher understanding of spirituality beyond an ecstatic relationship with nature. For a while, her ideas were popular among the wealthy class in Europe, and some artists were influenced by these ideas. In Sweden, a woman named Hilma af Klint created some of the first truly abstract paintings, but these paintings were not meant as art. They were illustrations for some of the esoteric ideas behind theosophy. A member of a group of women known as the Five, their interest was in making contact with the so-called high masters of theosophy. From 1896 until 1941, she made over 1,000 works, but in fact, af Klint requested that no one see her paintings until 20 years after her death, and it wasn't until 1980 that her work was seen by the general public. Although she was making fully non-objective paintings before anyone else, because no one saw them, they did not influence the development of abstraction. That would come later, with a Russian artist living in Germany, Bosley Kandinsky. Kandinsky originally studied law, but in 1896, at age 30, gave that up to study art in Munich, where he could be exposed to the avant-garde artists. He was both an artist and an art theorist, and in 1910 wrote an influential book on the spiritual in art, which was influenced partly by theosophical ideas. He was also greatly influenced by the abstract nature of music. He wrote, "Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is a piano with many strings. The artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul." Some say that Kandinsky also had a condition known as synesthesia, in which the brain misinterprets sensory input, and in Kandinsky's case, when he heard sounds, he saw colors. No wonder color was so important to him. He felt that abstraction was a way to access the spiritual, and that painting was essentially visual poetry. Kandinsky also was a teacher and associated with many artists in Europe. Therefore, unlike Hilma Klint, Kandinsky's work is often seen as the first completely abstract works. Dutch artist Piet Mondrian was another who was influenced by the spiritual ideas of theosophy, and he actually was a member of the Theosophical Society. He had moved from Amsterdam to Paris and was influenced by the Cubist work he saw there. However, he returned to the Netherlands in 1914 and was stuck there due to the war. He lived in an artist colony and was influenced by both Theo van Doesburg and Bart van der Lek, who was using only primary colors in his work. Mondrian is an interesting case, because his movement from representation to pure abstraction over the years is quite easy to follow. This is a good example of how artistic thinking develops over time. Mondrian was a member of a group known as Distill, to style, and he developed a theory of art known as neoplasticism, which used only primary colors and black lines on a white ground. Arriving at this reductive theory of abstraction, Mondrian saw pure abstraction as a way to access the spiritual. Kazimir Malevich was one of the leading Russian artists in this regard. His experiments with pure geometrical shapes led to the development of a theory of art he called Suprematism, which put forward the primacy of pure feeling in art. In his manifesto he wrote, "Art no longer cares to serve the state and religion. It no longer wishes to illustrate the history of manners. It wants to have nothing further to do with the object as such, and believes that it can exist in and for itself, without things, that is, the time-tested wellspring of life." By the mid-20th century, formalism was the predominant driver of art, especially painting. There are many artists and many takes on the application of these formalist theories. In 1913, a show of European modern art was held at the 69th Regiment Armory in New York City. This introduced ideas about modern art to American artists. This seminal exhibition, along with the immigration of many European avant-garde artists to America during World War II, gradually shifted the locus of the art world from Paris to New York. American artists were quick to adopt these new ideas about art. A style dubbed abstract expressionism by art critic Robert Coates in 1946 is perhaps the first truly American art movement. These artists brought a typically American Wild West attitude towards painting. Abstract Expressionism is known for its spontaneous process and emotional intensity. Championed by galleries owners like Peggy Guggenheim and Julian Levy, AbEx painters fell into what critics Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg dubbed action painters and color field painters. Greenberg, influenced by Marxist ideas, saw painting as nothing more than marks on a canvas. When Jackson Pollock lay his canvases on the floor and began dripping his paint as he moved around the canvas, the spontaneous intuitive process became the embodiment of Greenberg's theories about painting, and Rosenberg said Pollock's canvases were not pictures, but the recording of event which liberated Pollock from political, moral, and aesthetic values. Other artists use this kind of spontaneous approach to painting, and because you can almost track the paint as it applied to the canvas, these artists became known as the action painters. Other painters like Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman used color and scale to try and depict pure human emotion. Helen Frankenthaler, one of the few well-known AbEx women painters, and Morris Lewis poured their paint onto the canvases, incorporating the nature of the liquid to help form the image. These artists became known as the color field painters. There was a certain angst and tragedy in the abstract expressionist movement that was reflected in the lives of these artists. Arshile Gorky and Rothko committed suicide. Pollock was killed in a car accident at age 44. William de Kooning, a heavy drinker all his life, succumbed to Alzheimer's at age 92. Partly in reaction to the emotional angst and spontaneous style of the AbEx painters, the next generation of artists who had a wide influence wanted a more controlled and cerebral style. The work of these artists is called geometric abstraction, or sometimes hard edge painting. Like the earlier artists who had used geometry as a purer form of expression, these artists used shape and flat color to create purely optical experiences, where the painting was an aesthetic object that did not represent either reality or emotion. This emphasis on the optical experience led some artists to experiment with optical illusion. Using the hard-edge style, they began to reintroduce elements like mathematical perspective, using both line and color, into their work. Some artists pushed this idea of reducing art to its essential elements as far as they could go. While very similar in style to the hard-edge painters, their work was concerned with the gestalt of the viewer's experience to the object in a philosophical sense. These works, where less is more, become almost Zen-like objects. This style, known as minimalism, was realized mainly in sculpture, but some painters followed these ideas as well. The emphasis on form plays a major role in the development of art in the 20th century, but it is not without its critics. Some Marxist art historians see the obscure theory behind abstraction and the fact that abstraction has been promoted and collected by the economically elite as vehicles for helping to define power in the struggle between economic classes. Non-Western critics find the attempt to define universal or spiritual truth by primarily Western modern artists as culturally prejudicial. Feminist writers see the lack of women in these movements as evidence of patriarchy and the systematic exclusion of women from the art world. Clement Greenberg wrote, "As a kid, I drew and drew obsessively. I went to museums, but I wanted the story. I couldn't see the art." How could you go to a museum and not see the art? What is it that he's looking for? Perhaps if we look more carefully at formalism, whether we feel the ideas behind it are legitimate or not, maybe we'll get a glimpse of what these artists were searching for.